let's start with some, a brief introduction from us. So, first of all, welcome everyone to our Sitecore ninth meetup, Sitecore User Group Baltics ninth meetup, the last in this year before we go into our Christmas mood and the vacation. So, let's get started. So, what I will be doing is again requesting you guys basically to follow us. You will be hearing a lot of news on our social media pages, especially starting with LinkedIn, Facebook, Meetup, and also our YouTube channel, where all the recordings of our uh, Meetup are being uploaded and been shared there as well. So do join, follow, subscribe, whatever is feasible according to that. So the links are being posted in the chat. So for your finding it easy, where is our Sitecore user group Baltics? Okay. So then let's start with our agenda. So basically, we will be having one session, which is by Tamas Tarnok, and a bit of fun quiz after that. And yeah, so we can actually, Thomas, you have actually a bit more time if you are kind of planning something, unexpected demos or some stuff. Yeah, please, you can extend as well. So this is our approximate agenda. And yeah, so let's get started with introducing our dear friend, Tamas Tarnok. Tamas Tarnok, as you guys know, who is already, coming to our cycle, our regular attendees of Suk Baltics. He already presented during our initial meetups as well once. He's a software architect. I mean, he has a many different roles, starting, I would say, pure developer from the start of his career, and most importantly, is a five-time Sitecore MVP. And he has extensive experience in his .NET, ASP.NET. Basically, that's where he more in love with Sitecore, I guess. And then not a small experience, around 13, 14 years of experience from 2019. And yeah, recently you can see him using technologies or the expertise around Sitecore, .NET and Core.NET. And an additional thing, he was one of our core organizers in our Budapest SUCCON. And I really liked how he organized and how he presented Budapest was pretty awesome. Like thanks, Thomas and your team for showing us Budapest in his good way, good views. Okay, and I will hand over now to Thomas to start his most interesting topic, I would say, because people started to, uh, you know, build and deploy using Next.js as a framework, which was recently supported with the Sitecore Headless. So you will hear from our expert, Tamas Tarnok. Tarnok, I would hand over to you now.
Thank you. So I will start with sharing my presentation. Can you see my screen and presentation?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Yeah, thank you for the nice word. And it was a pleasure to be an organizer in Budapest of the SUCCON Europe. I hope you all enjoyed it.
Yeah.
But yeah, so this time I will talk about our experiences at Login with the Sitecore Headless projects. So far, we had a few, and this one will be about our first one and about a specific project, because with Next.js and Sitecore Headless now, you have really a lot of choices how you tackle different problems or different solutions. So yeah, just a few words about me, but most of them have been said already. So I am, yes, Tamas Tarnok. I am a software architect and I am a five-time Sitecore MVP. And after the presentation. If you have any question or anything, you can reach out to me on Twitter, and you can also follow my blog, where I recently post a lot about Sitecore Headless and mostly related to the Next.js SDK. So hopefully you will find this presentation useful. I will just share our story about this project. So first, let's have a look at the agenda. Then the first 3 points, we will talk about a bit about what is headless and what headless means in the Sitecore world. And first, we will talk about Sitecore Headless services, which is kind of the backend of the headless, and then I will talk about the Sitecore Next.js SDK, which is the front end implementation of the Sitecore Headless applications, and then I will share the story of our first Sitecore Headless project. So this one doesn't include any demo, but as we have a lot of time, and if you have questions, I am open for discussion. Also in the meanwhile, so if you have questions during the presentation, I can't see the questions in my window, but if you just turn on your microphone and ask something, I can interrupt my presentation. But we can also answer the questions at the end, if that's more comfortable for you. So let's have a look at in general, the headless CMS architecture. Just a little bit of comparing what is the big difference between a traditional CMS and the headless CMS. So on the left side, you can see the traditional CMS, which basically means that the content management framework and the presentation layer should run together. They can be distributed, but they always should run together, because the content delivery servers and the content management server and the front end, let's say the front end is also doing basically direct requests to access content to the database. And comparing to the headless CMS, the head means, in our case, the Next.js front-end application, but it can be any kind of head. And the body is the actual headless services inside Sitecore, which is giving you the content for one page in a JSON format. And this is processed by the front-end applications, in our case, the Next.js. And to run this basically head applications, you don't need to run, of course, a full content management system inside that application. You can run it basically with just an API connection to the Sitecore Headless services. So a short introduction to the Sitecore Headless services. This is the basically the backend, and this was released with the first version of Sitecore GSS, which is JavaScript services. This was also originally used for any kind of headless implementation in the past, but I believe with Sitecore 10, they switched to the term of Sitecore Headless services instead of Sitecore JavaScript services. Sitecore JavaScript services is still there, but it's meant to be only for using for JavaScript-based applications like the Next.js or React or Angular. So you can see that Sitecore GSS is there since, I don't know, maybe 2018 or something like that. I remember for the first presentations at Sitecore Symposium by the core team at that time. And now it's already 4 years old. So it's quite mature to use it in in a live project or in a production environment. So what is this? So the layout service is called basically the API endpoint, which gives you or gives back to the front end a specific page with all the placeholders and renderings inside in it. And this one is processed by the front end applications. And in general, JSON response is used, of course, instead of HTML. And the reason because it's easier to process by basically any programming language which has access to the web. So just a short recap. What's the layout service response? So this is an example response of the layout service. You can see it's a JSON, and I will just go through some bits of this response. So first we have always a root object called Sitecore. Inside that we have the main context object, which is basically providing some kind of global data and not related to the not only related to the page itself, but for example, if you are in editing mode or not, or which user is logged in at the moment or requested by requested the layout service endpoint. And I zoom back. Oops, let me go back. The next big object is the root. So the first one was the context, next is the root. And the root means page, basically. So this is the every information about the page. And here we can see some page level content like the name, display name, and also the fields. So on this page, I only have one field, which is called page title. But if I would have more, then all of the fields would be shown here. And then some other content or data about the page itself. And the next big one is the placeholders. I will open that up. So the placeholders is actually the presentation details of that actual page, and I'm just dividing or splitting it by components. So first, inside the GSS main placeholder, we have a default layout called, and inside the default layout, we have two placeholders, the header and the content. And inside that, I can have multiple renderings. And this is one rendering, and this is another one. The rendering it's usually containing the fields, and this is processed by the front end. So for example, if you want to render a logo in the header, then this field is actually provided by the component itself, and this one is just the text component, which only contains text. So this is how the layout service response is built up, and this response is basically processed by the Next.js SDK. And the content resolvers come into play if I go back, when we are talking about different renderings. So for example, for the header rendering, we need to set, if it's working from a data source, then we need to set to use the data source resolver. There are some built-in content resolvers by Sitecore. And one of them is the data source resolver, which is what is doing is actually converting the database item into a JSON response, but in a granular level, because it's only affecting the response of that specific component. And there are some other more default built-in content resolvers, but we can also implement our own custom content resolvers. For example, if we need to extend the data or reduce the data because we don't need all of the fields for a component. Yes. So the next slide is about talk a bit about the infrastructure in general. So usually without headless, what we have is we have one database server, which is a really simplified solution, and we have one content management server and the content delivery server. And of course, we have here the identity server, the XConnect, and all the analytics related ones. But it's not really important for this now, because what I want to show here is that how we build up the infrastructure is that for every role we had also the same application or the same repository actually used to be deployed to a different applications. So we had one separated Next.js application connected to the Sitecore content management server. Of course, this one was not opened to the public world. It was inside the private network where the Sitecore CM.
Actually, you are on mute.
Yeah.
Can you hear
Can
me
you?
now?
Yeah, now it's okay, Tom.
Yeah, sounds
How
perfect.
long was it mute?
No, no, it's less 10, 15 seconds. About the CM being in
Okay.
the private server. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for defying me. So we have the Next.js CM application separated, and oops, and this is connected to the Sitecore CM application, and it has it in the same private network as the CM application, and it has of course a low traffic because this is not really used by anyone. It's only basically used for the preview and experience editor for Sitecore. Because to use the experience editor, you need a connection from the Sitecore content management server to the Next.js application. So Sitecore is actually handling all the extra HTML which needs to be injected to make for example, the text field editable inline the experience editor. And therefore, you can see there is one Sitecore content delivery server, which is connected to the Next.js content delivery server. And this has much more resources assigned to it, so we can handle differently the two applications, I mean, the two Next.js applications. So let's talk about the Next.js SDK. So as I already talked about the layout service, the SDK, one of the work it's doing is processing that layout service response and mapping that to different objects into the Next.js application. But let's see what is Next.js first. So Next.js by Vercel. So Vercel is the company who is developing it. And they say this is the React framework for production. I want to emphasize the following rendering methods. So basically in Next.js, you can decide how you want to render the HTML. And there are 4 options for it. One is the server-side rendering. It's pretty simple. It works similar way like the Sitecore MVC. So the HTML of the actual page is rendered on the server side of the Next.js application. The next one, which is a bit bound together with the incremental static generation, is the static site generation. This means the HTML is built up on publish time, so not on runtime or on request time when you request the page. But when we publish, for example, a new page, then the HTML is pre-generated on a some kind of a file system, for example, an Azure Blob Storage or S3 storage in AVS. And then when the browser or the client requests a page, then basically what it does is just rendering out the HTML file which was generated before. This is useful when you have really static data. So when every user needs to see the same content, for example, like news portals or any kind of open public portals. And the last one is the client side rendering. Is, as it says, it's rendering out the HTML on the client side and not on the server side. This is more likely used for single page applications, and there is a blurry line between the client side rendering and server side rendering because they can work together, but I will talk about that. So let's jump into what we have in the Sitecore Next.js SDK. So what basically Sitecore provides us is one is the component factory. This is basically responsible for resolving the components dynamically. I mean, the components here is, for example, a text component or a link text or a header or a footer. The next one is the placeholder resolver. This is deciding where to put the different components which has been resolved, so in which placeholders. And it also provides field helper components. If we compare with the MVC implementation, it's really similar like the field helpers we have there. So for example, a link field helper or image field, which is really useful because if you use these helper components, then automatically it will be editable inline inside the experience editor. So I really suggest to everyone to use the field helpers instead of using the raw TypeScript objects. So the next one is in general the layout service fetching and mapping. So basically in the Next.js application, we just have to configure where is our Sitecore and the connection and the rendering and fetching of the pages is done by the Sitecore framework on the Next.js application. It also supports multi-language, but it's a bit different way when you use the MVC. So it's really important when you set up the languages inside Sitecore. You need to set up once in Sitecore, just a good old way that you create a new language under the languages. But you also need to set up the front-end application to accept those languages. There's the configuration file where you can list out all the languages which should be supported by the front-end. The next one is the Sitecore Analytics and Experience Editor support. And the last one is really important one, is the disconnected mode. This was quite useful for us and we used it a lot. Basically, this means or enables the front-end developers to work with mocks, so mocked Sitecore data instead of real Sitecore connection. So this means in the file system, they can create YAML files which are describing pages. So for example, I can, if I go back to the layout service, I can mock this data in a more simpler way because I don't need to create or defining all the fields. But in the YAML, I can just define, for example, under the JSS header, I have a component name called header, and inside that header component, I want to define or retrieve a logo image field. And this can be done in like a few lines of the YAML. And then from that point, you just need to switch between the connected and disconnected mode without any code change. And then it will work with the mock data if you use the application in disconnected mode. Yes. So I will talk a bit more on this. So as we just had a look how the Next.js SDK looks like in the Sitecore world, let's me dive into our first Sitecore Headless project. In the beginning, I will talk about the initial requirements and the project setup we had, and then about building the actual solution. So we had some, let's say, technical requirements as well. So the first one is that the client wanted, of course, if the client wants to finish the project in a short time frame, but really in this project, the main goal was to go to production with an MVP in a relatively short time frame, which was kind of 7-8 months, and then see how to develop from that point. So the customer already had Sitecore 10.1 MVC site where the actual upgrade was still in progress, and full implementation was in MVC. But with the Next.js SDK, we wanted to use that. And this is available only since 10.2. So what we had to do first is to do a minor upgrade from Sitecore 10.1 to 10.2. And then we could start development. And yeah, we were the first one who introduced the headless technology with Next.js for the client. So the client was quite technical. So they had technical stakeholders we had to align with, and also we had to have approvals for each architectural decisions. So they were voting for the headless technology. And a little bit about the project domain. It was a booking system where basically people can book different kind of activities in a specific time frame. So, for example, if I want to go to mini golf between 10 to 12 o'clock on Wednesday, this was the website to book it through, do the payment and everything. So it's more like a single page application rather than a static site. So a traditional CMS driven site. So we decided to have much more focus on the business requirements than introducing or having the Sitecore Headless all of the functionalities and all of the new features used. So everything was new for us. This was our first headless project with Next.js. So it was really important to make these decisions in the beginning, to meet with the deadline, and also all the requirements. And besides Sitecore, we had to integrate a lot of external services, which were in some cases were pretty slow. We also had to tackle that. I will talk about that as well. And these services like booking, payment, product information. So basically, Sitecore was only didn't really provide too much content because most of the content was coming from different external systems. But what they wanted to do is to is to store all the labels and some images inside Sitecore to make them editable, and also the layout. So first we had to put together a developer team, and it was quite easy because we had available front-end developers, senior front-end developers, which I would say for the first project you have to have almost I would say in every tech team you should have at least one senior developer who can drive that team. But in our case, we were all seniors on the project, so it was easy to understand each other and understand the different technologies. And everyone had a good overview of the other tech stack. So, for example, as a front-end developer with Next.js who doesn't have experience with Sitecore yet, it's really important to have another Sitecore developer who can explain how Sitecore works and what are the templates, what are the placeholders, what are all of these terms in the Next.js SDK. And on the other hand, as a senior Sitecore developer or Sitecore developer, you would need sometimes explanation from the front-end developers how things are working in Next.js or React. So then actually the communication was really, really important between the developers, especially in the beginning of the project when everyone was actually learning in the first few weeks how the Sitecore Headless works together with Next.js and how to set up the environment and things like that. So just to recap, so we had 2 senior front-end developers, 1 senior Node.js developer. This was needed for the external API development because there were a lot of external APIs. And what we did is that we did or implemented another layer, which was a wrapper around these APIs. And this was actually calling the different APIs and merging the response to get together to the front end application. So we decided to not have all the calls inside the Next.js application, but to have from the front end point of view simple APIs or simple one API call to get some data to the Azure functions which we implemented. And of course, we had one tech lead focusing on infrastructure and DevOps. So the project in it, this was before the sprints. So first we started to discover the initial requirements and all of the basically all of the requirements we need to fulfill. And it turned out that because it will be an SPA business application, it's not really important to have the editing option or the experience editor enablement and to have a granular component on the page. So we decided to use quite big components instead of small ones because this was really speeding up the development, and later it can be anyway easily splitted up to different components. But at this time, the client didn't know yet how atomic components they need, so we went with the simplest and fastest solution. Of course, the drawback of this is the experience editor, so they didn't have too much to play with or rearrange one page because most of our pages were 1 or 2 big components which were hard coded. But it was only because of the tight deadline. Yes. So the, the the zero sprint was started with the upgrade I mentioned before, and we also found out how to work together between these three teams. So we had the front end team, we had the Sitecore team, and we had let's say the Node.js backend or API team. We just drink a bit. So we had these three teams, and the big problem we had to solve is a dependency on each other. So the front end was almost always was depending on the other two teams. So on the Sitecore team to make maybe some components inside Sitecore or doing the template changes, and the other team was the Node.js team, where actually the front-end developer had to wait until the API is done, then he could integrate that. But to tackle this, because these are not a small chunk of development pieces, we had to find out something to work in parallel. And we came up with mocks. So Sitecore already had the disconnected mode to help us here, because basically the front-end developer could just build up the pages in a YAML file without knowing too much about Sitecore. Front-end developers just had to be familiar with what is the placeholder, what is a component, and how placeholders are containing different components. And from there, they could build up their own pages with different components, and those could be imported to Sitecore. And the other one to solve, the other dependency was around the API, the third party APIs, where we also used mocks. So we actually always aligned on the API schema. So what are the input parameters, which method is accepted, and how the response would look like. And these APIs could be easily mocked and faked inside the Next.js application. So inside the Next.js application, we had a mock API, basically to mock the original Node.js Azure function API calls. And with that, we actually could resolve all of the dependencies, and everyone could work together without blocking each other. And another important point was to decide on which kind of Next.js rendering method we would use, and we used server-side rendering. The reason was that everything basically was depending on the user login. So none of the pages were available without a login. And to make this work, it was easier, and the best way was to do the server-side rendering. When we think about traditional static kind of CMS systems where the content is always the same, this is not a good approach. For that, you can use static site generation. That's more resource. That doesn't need that much resource to host the Node.js application or Next.js. So that was the first sprint, and now until the sixth sprint, basically we were working on separately on different features, each team. And at the end of this sprint, we started to bind together the features. The main problem here we had is that basically for 6 sprint, we couldn't move any story to the QA because one of the element was missing or not bound together with the front end yet. So this was a big drawback for us because it was more like a waterfall kind of project instead of Scrum. But yeah, we had to live with this if we didn't want to block each other on different stories or features. And then after that, of course, we could just put the QA and then put the user acceptance test. So in the critical 7th and 8th sprint, what we did is to binding together the key features on the front end. So at this point, we had done everything or most of the features also on the API side and on the Sitecore side and also the front end, but with mocks everywhere. So here we started to bind together the front end with the third-party APIs and also with Sitecore. And that's when the QA actually started. And of course, here some user journeys has been discovered, which wasn't really covered in the user story. So had to fix these in the next sprint. And then, yeah, so in this from 8 to 12 sprint, so nearly 2 months, what we have done is basically doing the QA and doing a lot of bug fixes. And maybe I wouldn't say they are bug fixes. So some of them were bug fixes, but in this time we discovered these edge cases. For example, with the payment and booking and everything, and how the concurrent sessions are handled and things like that. And also we had the performance test after this sprint. So let's say we have now a kind of bug-free Next.js application. And here we started to do the performance and penetration testing by an external company. There were some issues we also had to fix, but the main issue was with the performance. So what we have discovered is that the third-party API responses were pretty slow, and we didn't have any chance to do any optimizations because they were black box systems. We didn't have any access to look into it, how they are working. So we had to come up with some kind of workaround. And what we did is to basically cache everything. So we cached all the responses from the third-party APIs with a very short time to leave, which was 5 minutes. And this was acceptable for the business. So this was great because what we used here is Redis cache. It's pretty easy with the key. What we did is just cached the response, the JSON response of the APIs. And if we had this in the cache, then we read it through the Redis cache. And if it was not in, then we send the request from the front end to the third-party API. And then, of course, the response was slower. But after the first call, it was always going to the Redis cache for 5 minutes. And we use the Node Redis package on the Next.js application server side. And this was pretty easy to set up the Redis connection and also doing some simple comments. So let's talk about the infrastructure a bit. We already touched that in the beginning, but in this project, what we had is basically on the right side. We had the Azure Kubernetes services running the Sitecore content management and content delivery. And inside this, we had the two app services for the Next.js application, one for the CM and one for the content delivery. And here in this resource group, we had the Redis cache. And here, if you see, there are some connections which is not on the picture. A huge part is missing from this diagram is the actual third-party services, which is a huge number of services we had to connect to. Yeah, Sitecore also had a connection to Content Hub, but this is not really important in our case, and also had the Cloudflare as a CDN. Oops. So a bit more about the infrastructure here. We really went with the simple solution. In Azure, you can host Docker images and or Docker containers. And what we did is basically we used the same image or similar image, which we could build locally for local testing. And the same Docker image could be deployed to the Azure App Service. And we used, of course, the Linux, I think some kind of Ubuntu machines behind it. And we also went to production with this setup. So we are still monitoring if this is enough for us, but for the MVP, it was enough to have the Docker images. But there are plans to move this one in to the Kubernetes services as well. But we will see. For a short in this short time frame, it was pretty easy to set the front end up.
Thomas, I have a question here. So
Yes.
why was the CM being connected to CDN? So what was the use of it? This React, this one.
So which CM?
No,
Sorry,
the app service.
app
Not the
service.
Yeah.
Yes. There is no real need. I think this is not right here because this is not publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe I was not aware of the Cloudflare configuration, but as far as I understood, also the company network was managed by Cloudflare.
Mm-hmm.
So they could reach with a VPN through Cloudflare, the CM.
Okay. But not the CDN purpose. Yeah.
Yeah. So they were using Cloudflare for multiple stuff, not just as a CDN. But this is not really needed. Yeah, if the users or if the company users has access directly to the Azure network.
Okay, thank you.
So yeah, so let me share some learnings. So I think using the Next.js comparing to the Sitecore MVC applications, it's much more comfortable and faster for dev teams to do the implementation because front-end developers are not bound to MVC. They don't need to change any Razor files or understand the technology which they don't really need to understand, like the C# and how MVC is working. So here they could use their React framework and Next.js, and I think it was a good choice from Sitecore to support Next.js because it's truly a good framework and it's really easy to work with. What is a bit maybe hard to understand on the first place is is the the exact line between the server side and the client side, because you run, JavaScript, and it can run on server and client side as well. And in some cases, there are some cases where the same code, sometimes it's running on the client side, and in some cases, it's running on the server side. So you really need to be careful which object is used in which, so which JavaScript object is used in which area. Because, for example, if you want to have access to the local storage, definitely you don't have access to that from the server side. So, and this is because of the hydration. They call it hydration in Next.js, that on the first request, when you load the Next.js application, it's running on server side. So all the HTML is generated on the server side. But on the next request, if you just click on a link inside the application, and this is also supported by Sitecore, then it's not reloading the full page or the full HTML of the page on the server side, but it's just sending a request to the Next.js server, and then it's coming back with the JSON response, and then it's doing the client side rendering. So sometimes the same code was running on client side and sometimes on server side. Yes, so another thing which we didn't really use is the GraphQL. But as this was our first project with Next.js, we didn't want to introduce too much new stuff in it. So we were a bit afraid of using GraphQL because no one had real experience with the Sitecore GraphQL. But this is really something you should consider on your projects, because instead of using custom content resolvers, you could use GraphQL. Sorry, there was a... Oh, is there a question or just a unmuted mic?
Yeah, unmuted mic.
Okay. So the GraphQL would be a good choice for you, because it's also supported on XM Cloud. So once the client wants to go to the cloud using XM Cloud, that could be easier to migrate if you use only GraphQL than the layout service and custom content resolvers. Yes, so as I mentioned a few times, the communication was very important between the teams, and it took a bit of time to understand how the experience editor is working together with the Next.js application. So basically, how it works is the experience editor, when you load the page, then there is a request to the Next.js application. There is an API called API pair render, I believe, or editing, or something like that. And when that API is called in the Next.js side, then it's rendering out all of the extra HTML which is needed for the Sitecore experience editor. And then the response is processed by Sitecore, so it just renders out the HTML in experience editor. But of course, it could be difficult if you have some kind of network limitations between the two applications. So you have to be aware of that. We need connection from both directions. So we need connection from Sitecore to the Next.js application, and also from the Next.js application to Sitecore in case of a CM. In case of uh, content delivery server, you don't need this. You just need one connection from the Next.js application to the Sitecore content delivery servers. So yeah, in that time I don't have a demo, but I'm happy to answer to any question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. Any questions? Okay. Inters is writing. Why
I see one
Next.js?
question.
Yeah, okay.
So why Next.js? Why not
Mhm.
Vue or React or even Angular? Is it because of the server side development? Yes. So one because if you want to host a React or Angular, I'm not a front end dev guy, so uh, I just share my best knowledge. But I think for that you would need a Node.js server, and also to make it work with the Sitecore Experience Editor, it's a bit tricky with the integrated mode. So I saw some projects with that, and it was not easy to set it up. And React and Angular only knows the client side rendering. So I think these are the good reasons. Okay, there's a few more. I can read the questions. So what did senior Sitecore developers do code-wise? If front-end devs would know how Sitecore works, what there still be needed for Sitecore developers? Good question. Uh, so what? So I was, of course, one of the Sitecore developers. I was implementing also the templates and also the renderings inside Sitecore. So the front-end devs didn't have to basically log in into Sitecore. And also I have implemented a few custom pipelines and content resolvers. But to be honest, it was not much Sitecore work on this project. So what I did personally, and I liked to do, is to take over some tasks from the Next.js app, which were mainly server side. So I was not actually I'm not good at designing and writing CSS and HTML, but I can think of how to do things on the server side or to fulfill some business requirements and implement some business logic on the front end. So this was for me personally was pretty nice, and I got also some let's say training from our front end devs. So I learned a lot from them, and they also learned a lot about Sitecore. Uh, so were APIs for external services also written in Next.js? Does it mean C# can go home and look for other job opportunities? Yeah, so the API for the external services was written by Node or in Node, so basically JavaScript. But the only reason was that because we choose this technology, it could be done by using C# as well. But in this team setup, we just felt more comfortable doing with Node.js and be open to learn new stuff. So uh, that's one of my advice. And really, if maybe one more point about the Next.js and Sitecore dev transition. So once you understand the structure of the front end code and how the components look like, it's not that complicated, and it's really you can compare to the Sitecore MVC implementations. You have the same kind of functionalities or SDK functions like in the Sitecore MVC world. Just it's using a different language basically. So who
Yeah,
were
agree.
pushing? Sorry.
I agree with Thomas on the learning point as well, because even I'm kind of married to C sharp, I would say, I mean, .NET. But
Yeah.
still, over a period of time, like it's almost 2 decades, and I kind of learned that I should not be married to any technology. Learn things, go into the future, go with the flow, all the stuff. But definitely, yeah, don't be get married to one technology. Always learning is good, and go with the flow, learn new technologies. Yeah, if it is relevant, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, so in my opinion, once you understand one language,
Yeah.
you can easily learn others. So the language itself shouldn't be a barrier. I think it's maybe more like the understanding how that language works or actual framework in deep. But that comes with time. So okay, so next, the last question: who were pushing the approach and structure of data contracts? Front-end devs, back-end devs, Sitecore devs, or content editors? Yeah, so we were, so as a dev team, so the front-end, the back-end, and Sitecore, we were pushing off using the contract. Also for the backend devs, so for the Node.js devs, it was a requirement to document all the APIs for the client. So and and they just started to use open API specifications. So we thought that's a good approach, and we did the same for Sitecore. Oh yes, I didn't mention that we also implemented some custom APIs for Sitecore to get some content. Yeah, but about the contracts, everyone was writing their own. So, for example, if I would be a backend developer for the API, I would write the API specification by my own and then share it with the front-end dev. And then we could see if there was a misunderstanding or something not clear, and then we jumped into the core basically and discussed. So the actual implementation of the APIs was much more time than defining the structure.
I do have one question, Thomas. So,
Mhm.
uh, did you blog about the experience editor functionality? Because I know it is the difficult part, right? So, I don't want you to explain here, but if you have any blog related to setting up experience editor on Next.js projects, it would be, good for us to
Yeah.
learn more about it.
Unfortunately, I don't have a blog about this. I am not sure if Sitecore has its own. I was planning to do a blog about the what was it? Some kind of error codes. So because
Hmm.
I got a lot of also different responses from the layout service. For example, if you don't have a license which enables Sitecore Headless,
Hmm.
you can still install the Headless and you don't get any error, and you will get the first error when you try to reach the layout service. And that's just, I believe, a 403 or
Hmm.
401. I don't remember. And I had to literally check the logs, what's going on, and then I saw that the license was still the old one.
Hmm.
Uh, and there are some API codes which I didn't find documented. I had to use some decompiler to check what's going on, but it was, yeah. But mainly, I mean, on a local machine, setting up experience editor is not a problem because you have everything, and
Yeah,
you have the
exactly.
Docker image
Mhm.
provided by Sitecore. But when you move to another environment, I think what to check mainly is the network. So if you have any restriction on the network between the applications, that works to double check if something is not working. Also using curl or PowerShell to test if the connection is correct and what are the responses. We also had some problems with Cloudflare because Cloudflare told, I don't know, VR attackers or something like that, and didn't allow us to do the request. So yeah, maybe I can write a blog post about it. Just
Yeah,
some
good. Yeah, it
thank you
would be
for the
definitely helpful because a lot of people are on this same boat as you were in the next year's implementation. So just want to share that with the community.
yeah.
Good, good.
Thanks.
Any
Thanks
other
for the topic.
questions? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So if not, then yeah, thank you, Thomas. Thank you so much for your wonderful time. And it was really great, great session. And do watch out for our recording. We will be sharing soon in our YouTube channel.